Thank you, Lee, and thank you for inviting me along today. I'll make sure I try and mind my P's and Q's. I was asked for a title. I couldn't think of anything better than that. I'm sorry, Trees and Stormwater together at last. I mean, that's pretty much it. It's what we're here for. And consequently, I've not given too much background here because I think we all know sort of why we're here and what we're trying to achieve. I'd just like to sort of acknowledge the people who have worked with sort of on these projects sort of over the last couple of years. Some from Melbourne Uni, others as well, such as Vaughan Gray from City of Moreland and seconded at the moment to Melbourne Water. Also, Harry Viraswamy did some work with us back in the day at Melbourne Uni and now being at Alluvium. So I guess what I'm showing here is a composite. Both the work we've done and the ideas we've generated involves all of these people, as well as the people where we've actually done these sort of trial systems. So people like Ari and Ralph, many people who you'll know already. I hate saying it's a no-brainer, but it is a no-brainer, is it? I mean, trees and stormwater, it sort of makes sense. It's good for trees to try and irrigate them passively, to try and get a bit more water resource to trees, to make them grow bigger and better, to make them drought-proof for the future. In terms of urban streams, it also makes sense. It's one of our guiding principles of water-sensitive urban design to make use of stormwater as a resource. And so it's a good thing to basically try and use it as best we can. Where conflict can kind of arise, sort of what we've seen is what's the actual design intent of what you're trying to achieve? Is it just about the tree, or is it equally about stormwater runoff and trying to retain stormwater runoff volumes back to sort of pre-development levels? And so I haven't got terminology quite right yet, but when I think about passive irrigation, I think about it really is about the tree and the push coming from councils to rapidly increase canopy cover. And so I've kind of put in teeny tiny little text, sort of tree and runoff as the design intent for passive irrigation. If someone can come up with a better term than street tree stormwater control measures or tree-based stormwater control measures, that would be awesome. But when I think about those, I think about the design intent really is sort of equally between providing benefit to the tree, but also really trying to meaningfully reduce runoff volumes. And so we kind of try and figure out what we're doing in the first instance. Is it about both tree and runoff or mainly about the tree? And that informs sort of design. And both are sensible objectives depending on what you're trying to achieve and where. So what I'll run through today is a couple of the field experiments which we've done out in the city of Monash a couple of years ago and more recently in Moreland, and sort of what the design intent of those has been and the results we've found from them. Then I tried to wrap those up into what I usually call stuff we learned what we wouldn't do again, but which people like Harry from Alluvium would call design principles, which sounds much more advanced and nice. And then how that's informed some work we're about to start out in the city of Melton, where we're actually trying to put these learnings and these ideas into practice. And finally, if there's time, I'll talk about some ideas for these tree-based stormwater control measures. So actually trying to think more broadly about redesigning streetscapes for actually trying to retain large volumes of stormwater. And we'll run through that. So some of you may be sort of aware of the work we did out at Monash a couple of years ago, where we were trying to look at the balance between sort of, I guess, maintenance requirements of different inlets and sort of have a look at stormwater capture performance, tree performance by installing infiltration trenches alongside established trees. And all this pic is really showing is that we tried two types of inlets, lintel and also a pit inlet. And just from the sort of cross sections here, the pit inlet you can sort of see has a permeable paver filter in it, and both systems pretty much behind the curb were exactly the same. And so they go into a 6 square metre infiltration trench in the nature strip. And this is one that's sort of halfway through construction here. And so they were sized, I guess, in the first instance, I suppose, we came at this from really wanting to think about stormwater runoff volumes and performance, as well as trying to provide benefit to the established trees. And so as a consequence, we sort of sized them, and so Harry did all of this work in terms of trying to figure out, okay, what size storage do we need to create in the nature strip in order to meaningfully reduce runoff volumes. So these systems were sort of designed to capture about 80% of volumetric runoff. And that was with some pretty good assumptions we thought at the time in terms of saying, okay, maybe our inlet's 50% blocked, so half the time it's blocked and can't receive water, and also some pretty realistic exfiltration rates in terms of a couple of millimetres per hour. And so as a result, they ended up being something in the order of like a 2x3, so 6 square metres. It can hold something in the order of about 1,500 litres of water. So we installed 24 of these systems around the city of Monash in 4 different streets, depending on soil type and the type of tree. So we ended up with 24 and 12 of each kind of inlet. There's a lot of sort of data here, but effectively we ended up with a lot less retention than we expected with these sorts of systems. So they were designed to capture something in the order of 80%, and we ended up with about, on average, something like 18%. It's going, what the hell's going on there? But we also got high variability sort of among our systems. So some captured very, very little. Some were kind of getting up to more like something like 44% of the runoff generated in the street catchment. And so what happened, and this story is familiar to many of you. It's phenomenal the amount of litter and debris which is generated by streets in a normal suburban area. And so these kind of inlets, even if they're kind of really cute and they've got all these kind of design sort of principles to effectively keep them operating, there's an awful lot of sediment and debris which eventually, or not eventually, quite quickly sort of clogs them up and stops them from actually receiving water. And you can see from those pictures there's not a hell of a lot of opportunity for water to actually sneak past all that muck. And so blockages really are driving sort of, performance capture. But, we always try and take some positives from this. I guess that's the stormwater side of things. They didn't perform as we intended. But when we have a look at, say, that kind of getting up to the 44% retention kind of end, we're talking about a hell of a lot of water. And so something in the order of like 46 cubic metres of water captured over 18 months, which is a massive amount. And if you do a very simplistic sort of calculation of, okay, what would that be on a daily basis? You're talking about something like 80 litres of water per day. And some work that Jasmine Tom's done, doing a PhD in our group, sort of found that these trees can use something like 70 litres of water per day when it's warm. And so, we kind of say, okay, maybe these systems weren't so great in terms of runoff performance, but they did a great job of getting a decent amount of water to the trees. And so they can meet the established tree requirements. One thing, of course, we came to with this project is sort of providing some benefit to the tree. And so we were looking for, okay, do we get additional growth? Do we alleviate some drought stress by providing all that water resource to the trees? And interestingly, we sort of found that they didn't grow faster. They weren't less stressed. In fact, all of these trees didn't show any drought stress at all, even the control trees. And so when you dig about and have a bit of a play, you sort of find an established tree like this, not going to be the same everywhere, but an established tree like this is wrapped around the stormwater pipe, or it's ran into the nearest front garden where it's irrigated and it's getting heaps and heaps of water. And so it was an interesting one for us in terms of finding, no real benefit. But I wouldn't like to say, there's no point in irrigating an established tree. But I guess, if we move to a more densely urbanised area, somewhere that's sort of hotter and drier, we may find a different story. So from this project, I suppose we found that, complex inlets, they preserved the asset, if you want to put it like that. The infiltration trenches continued to function. They function just fine, but the inlets block up. They do their job of keeping all of the muck out of there. And effectively, that penalises your retention performance, how much water you can actually bring in. So if you wanted to actually try and hit the design objectives in terms of the volumetric targets, then the kind of maintenance you'd need on these sort of outlets might be something in the order of monthly, which is just too much for a normal suburban street. We sort of, equate it to, this would be the equivalent, of a bin run, or, it's a massive sort of operation to come around and clean out these individual inlets to keep them open. But with only a little bit of maintenance, they can function just fine and get enough water to the tree. And so if you're looking at this as just a passive irrigation system, they did a wonderful job. One of the big ones that I guess we really all know about, as soon as you operate in the nature strip, and this picture is a good example of it, you come across services, and an awful lot of them, and sort of the dial before your digs aren't necessarily that helpful for those of you who have been out involved with construction stuff. It's a big issue as soon as you start working in the nature strip, and something that we have to deal with. I think something like, in the course of the 2-year study with this one, I'd say 2 of our systems out of the 24 got blipped because the house was sort of knocked down and rebuilt, and so new services needed to be connected, so people dug through our infiltration trenches to reconnect. And so that's, it's pretty large percentage-wise in terms of the overall study installation. So it's a real thing. So as we kind of evolved from there, we went into Moreland, and so Vaughan Gray led this project up in Moreland, where he was starting to think about, okay, what are some more simple kind of inlets where we can kind of get away from this maintenance burden and start really passively irrigating trees. And this was the design intent here was effectively brand new street, trees never planted before. Let's see if we can boost initial growth and establishment by building some passive irrigation systems. And this little picture off to the right shows what he tried. So he had some control trees with just a standard cutout from the asphalt sort of sidewalk there, plant the tree as per standard, and then a whole bunch of different curb cuts. So maybe a curb cut and then the trees planted in the natural soil, or putting basically a biofilter profile behind the curb cut. Having a biofilter with an underdrain, but still with a saturated layer. And then this little one down the bottom, sorry, it might be a bit hard to see from the back, but this was one where effectively a biofilter profile was installed next door to a tree which was planted as per normal, so that it's not actually sitting in the water receiving kind of pit. So you can tell it's a tree focus rather than a stormwater focus because of the size of the system. So it's a standard kind of cutout from the sidewalk. So we're talking about something which can be as small as 0.15% of the impervious catchment. So it's obviously not designed for stormwater. So it can only hold something like in the order of a millimetre of rainfall. And exfiltration rates are really interesting because you have a look at that and you go, there's a heavy Brunswick clays, how are we getting 60 millimetres per hour? These are sort of in situ measurements because some of them have little leaks in them, or there's a big rock or something which is facilitating fast leakage from the pits. And so it was really quite variable, even in a small sort of study space. The really good thing that we kind of got from Vaughan was that effectively having some sort of passive irrigation could double the growth rate of trees in the first sort of year. And that was very exciting because I think that's what it's all about. If we think about passive irrigation and what it can do, it can get very rapid growth for us in the first instance. And the bigger your tree is, the faster it grows exponentially, and we'll get to that canopy cover a lot faster. What's important, I'm showing here sort of the control trees and the drain trees to sort of illustrate this growth. The important thing, and you probably all guessed it already, if you put your tree into a pit that's receiving water and you've got nowhere else for that water to go, you drown them and you kill them. And it makes perfect sense. And so when we talk about doubling growth rate, we're talking about only those systems where we either put the tree offset from where the pit was receiving water or had an underdrain. Retention performance, as you can guess, we end up with something in the order of 10% retention, volumetric retention sort of over the course of a year. And so it's very, very small. What we take from this is that simple inlets are great. And so this is a picture of one of those offset or adjacent sort of treatments where you're basically getting water just simply passively off the street. You've got a nice extended detention depth there to be able to capture as much water as you can, and you're not drowning the tree. So if you avoid waterlogging, then you're all fine. And more work from Jasmine in terms of measuring transpiration rates on these trees. We can sort of see that we're well and truly exceeding the water demands of these trees that only use something in the order of 4 litres of water per day when they're in leaf. But of course, if we want to get serious about retention, we need to increase the size of the pits and the number of pits, etc. So these are kind of the design principles we sort of came to, and I kind of highlighted it down the bottom there, sort of where I guess the information has come from, and at the same time having a look at a lot of other resources which are out there at the moment, and a lot of them are sort of popping up sort of recently too. So things like that recent Zam Worcester Healthy Land and Waterways sort of report on passive irrigation stuff. A lot of these simple, design principles which we've found, other people have found too. So we've got a lot more confidence in them. But things like a simple inlet, creating storage behind the curb, avoiding waterlogging, making sure that your system is actually designed to meet water demand of your tree so it can actually boost its growth, and then trying to avoid these service conflicts. And so this is what we sort of take forward. I'll mention sort of briefly the new work we're about to start out in the city of Melton. And so some designs were done up by Harry Verusomi and John O'McLean from Alluvium, trying to apply these principles. And so things like simple inlets, storage, avoiding waterlogging, meeting tree demand, avoiding services, that sort of thing. You may not be able to sort of see it too well, but there are 3 kind of designs. All of them, I guess up in that top, your left, work off having some gravel trenches which are installed either side of the tree with sort of a balancing pipe between them to share the water. And this particular one kind of may not be considered as a simple inlet, but it's a really nifty idea where it's basically tapping into the legal point of discharge coming from private property to actually bring water to this little infiltration trench, and then water can move on, or if that thing blocks up, can move on and join the drainage system as per normal. And so that's following, I guess, these design principles, and we're kind of expecting there to be not so many issues with clogging because we're not bringing stuff from the road. This one many of you will be familiar with as well, that people wanted to try was having a look at the tree net inlet and getting some values on the performance of that out in the field in the face of sort of sediment and debris. And so that one again is trying to put a less complicated inlet in the curb to actually bring runoff from the road into our infiltration trench. And then lastly, kind of borrowing, I guess, from a lot of the ideas from the Zam-Worcester approach and also from Vaughan's work in Moreland, is kind of going this curb cut approach and running water directly from the road, just passively through a curb cut into an infiltration trench alongside the tree. And so these are the things we're about to try and get some real world performance data on, particularly focusing on whether or not we're getting a boost to the tree in terms of its performance. I'll kind of finish with, I guess, talking about where we'd like to go from here and sort of these ideas about, can we start thinking about trying to seriously reduce runoff volumes with passive irrigation sort of designs or street tree stormwater control measures, whatever you would like. Again, Jasmine Tom's done some fantastic work from the work we did in Monash, where she's monitored transpiration of trees and done an annual water balance of what these kind of systems look like. And as we'd always hoped, this sort of data was starting to show that trees can use a hell of a lot of water. I think we all kind of already knew that, but getting some numbers on it was really important. When we look at the annual water balance, we're starting to talk about something like 20% of the water that's falling in the catchment being transpired by the trees. So they've got massive potential. And that's one tree capturing a couple of 100 square meters of runoff from the road. What would this look like even with a couple of trees or something like that? So the question is, how can we sort of boost this and actually start getting serious about volumetric retention in the street? And I guess when we look at what we've learned from Monash and what we want to kind of avoid in terms of the complexities of maintenance, etc., we come back to these very simple ideas. And they're ideas I know we've all had and will all be familiar to you in terms of things like removing the curb completely, having systems like this, which is say like a median strip in the middle of the road, where you can actually replace the media, get fast growth, subsurface reservoirs, check dams to manage and detain your water so that the trees can actually use it and get to some serious sort of runoff. Retention, while still preserving the essential functions of conveyance for big events and that sort of thing. And we've seen great examples of this all over the place. Lyndhurst, I'm sure everybody's sort of been out there at one point in time. And do we have numbers on these? Not that I'm aware of. Jason's work up in Hume as well, and then also some of this stuff in Moreland. You've got thumpingly big trees in these kind of systems. There's no curb, the water just passively flows off the street. And because the system's such a large percentage of its impervious area, you're not overwhelming it. It's actually holding a lot of water. And so they're really, really nifty concepts. Of course, we kind of go, well, how the hell are we going to get that in a typical suburban nature strip, which you all know is an absolute bloody nightmare because you've got sewer pipes, communications, power, gas, potable, recycled water in some places. And so when you take this big principle of like, I want to create massive storage now, within my nature strip in a normal suburban street, where the hell am I going to put it? And so you end up with this little blue box here of where you can sort of cram it in. Well, that's not exactly going to get us what we want. But maybe, and this is kind of when we start going a bit crazy and off topic, but the kind of things we'd like to sort of, think about are, well, wait a minute, we've just installed this massive drainage pipe down to, sort of 1 meter, 1.5 meters or something like that under the curb. We've backfilled it with gravel. That's kind of just like our infiltration trench. Are we missing something where we try and actually tap into that somehow? What if we put some baffles or something in that drainage system to actually hold it up? And you sort of, this picture over on the left here is from when we were doing the excavations for the infiltration trenches out at Monash. And, the stormwater pipe sort of basically underneath the curb. And, when we were digging it, it's sort of going, okay, we're going to dig this, we're going to cut the curb, put a complex inlet in, the pipe's right there. What would happen if we knocked a hole in that? I'm not an engineer, you probably figured out. But, these kind of ideas are just going, well, hang on a second, maybe we can start to think about trying to get bigger storage and be able to use what we've already got in streets with some retrofit ideas. This picture looks old because the idea is relatively old. This is from a guy called James Lee, who I think installed this sort of stuff in the mid-90s or whatever, where he starts doing things like, if we imagine these sort of silo type looking things as being, I guess, like a pretty standard side entry pit. He's done some simple modifications where he's just put some perforated pipe in the bottom of those side entry pits so that water effectively leaks out of the side entry pit or the formal drainage in the street and just leaks into the landscape. And probably in reality, when we think about the Monash stuff that we found, where the trees had plenty of water and were sucking water out of pipes and leaky surfaces and that sort of thing, this isn't far off that kind of concept. And so how will this thing actually perform, and what are the practicalities of it? Will it work? Will it still perform the job it's there to do in the first place? I guess what can maybe offset this is starting to think about, if we start doing things like this in the street, aside from the maintenance burdens and the practicalities, does this start to offset other things we do, like constructed wetlands down at the end of the catchment, or other sort of water-sensitive urban design techniques that we use? Does this start to offset that and become sort of less crazy and less different to what we currently do now? The other way to go, try and make a bit more storage in the nature strip. I dread to think what it would be like to coordinate people in order to move all the services half a metre that way. I'm sure people have tried. I don't want to say we can't do it, but it's a big ask. But if we can achieve things like that, and people already do things like sticking the stormwater drainage pipe actually under the curb rather than encroaching into the nature strip, what if we can actually make a bit of space and start thinking about these things which you would all be familiar with as well? So we see some great examples of structural soil installations in all sorts of parts of the world. We've got them here in Melbourne too. Some of you may have built them. And starting to think about these and some of the design concepts up there of, here's structural soil underneath the entire pavement, and then put a drainage pipe right at the bottom of that. Can we make a small modification and just raise that drainage pipe up in that structural soil trench to create a bit more storage in there? Now we've got a system which is a large proportion of our impervious catchment area, and the tree can basically just use water at will. And so these are the kind of things that we'd sort of really like to try. I guess this is a super urban kind of, downtown environment. So this kind of principle may not work out in the suburbs, but it's stuff that we should be thinking about, and it's been done elsewhere. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from it. And that's pretty much where I'll finish off, other than I guess sort of talking about, if we really want to do something about stormwater volume capture, then some big storage ideas would be really, really awesome, combined with some simple inlets. If you've got any ideas, I'd love to hear them. Thank you very much.